Welcome to Speed Reads. James. Part 1. Life for Jim in Hannibal, Missouri, was a constant performance. As a slave belonging to Miss Watson, he existed within the confines of a carefully constructed facade. He learned early on to dumb himself down, to adjust his speech patterns and behavior to appease his white owners and avoid punishment. This self-preservation tactic extended beyond his interactions with Miss Watson. Jim diligently taught his daughter, Sadie, and other enslaved children the art of playing dumb, a necessary survival skill in a society that deemed them inferior. Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, the town's quintessential boyhood adventurers, often included Jim in their games. While Tom, with his penchant for elaborate schemes, often exploited Jim for his own amusement, Huck displayed a genuine affection and curiosity towards his friend. The specter of separation loomed large. Miss Watson, driven by the insatiable greed of the slave trade, planned to sell Jim away from his family, likely to the Deep South. Faced with this imminent threat, Jim made the agonizing decision to escape. He fled to Jackson Island, a secluded refuge in the nearby Mississippi River, hoping to return for his family at a later time. His solitude was short-lived. Huck Finn, running away from his abusive father, sought refuge on the same island. Jim, aware that Huck's disappearance would inevitably lead to a search party, recognized the danger his presence posed to the boy. He resolved to protect Huck, knowing that his own freedom depended on the boy's safety. The rising Mississippi River forced Jim and Huck to abandon their hiding place. They scavenged supplies from a passing house, but the sight of a dead body within the dwelling deeply disturbed Jim. He urged Huck to leave, fearing for the boy's well-being. Their journey down the river was fraught with peril. They encountered a gang of riverboat robbers who, after a tense confrontation, were outmaneuvered by Jim and Huck. The robbers, however, left behind a valuable cache of goods, including a collection of books that Jim eagerly devoured. Their newfound freedom was short-lived. Their makeshift raft was destroyed in a storm, separating them momentarily. Jim, a skilled swimmer, managed to reach shore, while Huck was swept away by the turbulent waters. Alone and adrift, Jim encountered a group of enslaved men working on a nearby plantation. They shared their plight and offered him temporary shelter. One of the men, young George, moved by Jim's desperation, risked severe punishment by stealing a pencil from his overseer and giving it to Jim. However, the joy of this small act of kindness was quickly overshadowed by the brutal reality of slavery. Jim witnessed young George being savagely whipped for his act of defiance, a horrifying reminder of the brutality of the system. Unable to endure the sight, Jim fled the plantation, vowing to never forget the kindness of young George and the enduring spirit of resistance. Reunited with Huck, their journey continued. They encountered a pair of conmen posing as the Duke of Bridgewater and King Louis XVII. The charismatic duo, eager to exploit Jim's unique circumstances, devised a scheme to sell him into slavery for a hefty profit. Part 2. The encounter with the con men proved to be a turning point. While initially amused by their flamboyant theatrics, Jim quickly recognized the inherent danger of their presence. The Duke and the King, with their penchant for deception and exploitation, were a constant threat to their freedom. Their journey continued, marked by a series of near misses and harrowing encounters. The river itself, once a source of freedom, became a treacherous obstacle, its currents unpredictable and its waters teeming with dangers. One night, their boat was stolen, leaving them stranded and vulnerable. Forced to navigate the river on a makeshift raft, they were tossed and turned by the relentless waves, their fragile craft battered against the riverbank. Jim, a seasoned riverman, managed to guide them to shore, but the ordeal had taken its toll. Their encounter with the con men, however, provided an unexpected opportunity. Among the stolen goods, Jim discovered a small collection of books, a source of knowledge and solace in the midst of their perilous journey. He devoured these books, expanding his understanding of the world and fueling his determination to escape the bonds of slavery. Their path once again crossed with the Duke and the King. The con men, recognizing a lucrative opportunity, hatched a plan to sell Jim into slavery. They presented themselves as wealthy Southern aristocrats, eager to acquire a skilled laborer. The plan was executed with chilling efficiency. Jim was shackled and paraded through town as a prized possession. However, their deception was short-lived. The blacksmith, a gruff but surprisingly kind man named Easter, was appalled by the spectacle. He secretly removed Jim's shackles, promising to replace them later. The Duke and the King, unaware of Easter's intervention, returned the following morning to collect their property. To their dismay, Jim was unshackled. Easter, facing the wrath of the con men, explained that he had merely removed the shackles for the night to allow Jim some semblance of comfort. The situation escalated quickly. The Duke, enraged by the interference, struck Easter with his whip. This act of brutality enraged Mr. Wiley, the blacksmith's owner, who intervened, demanding an explanation for the assault. The ensuing confrontation exposed the Duke and the King as the frauds they were. Forced to flee, the con men abandoned Jim, leaving him in the hands of Mr. Wiley. While Mr. Wiley treated Jim with a degree of respect, the inherent brutality of the slave system remained. Jim was subjected to the daily grind of labor, the constant threat of violence ever present. One day, a group of white men arrived at the blacksmith shop. They were a traveling minstrel troupe, seeking a tenor for their performances. Recognizing Jim's strong voice, Emmett, the leader of the troupe, offered Mr. Wiley a substantial sum for Jim's services. Emmett, despite his involvement in the dehumanizing spectacle of blackface minstrelsy, seemed to possess a grudging respect for Jim's talent. He promised Jim a modest wage and, perhaps surprisingly, treated him with a degree of dignity, acknowledging his humanity. However, the minstrel show, with its inherent mockery of black people, proved to be a constant source of internal conflict for Jim. He was forced to perform in blackface, to contort his identity to entertain a largely white audience. The dehumanizing nature of the act weighed heavily on him, and he longed for a life beyond the confines of the minstrel stage. Part 3: Jim's life as a minstrel offered a brief respite from the drudgery of field labor. However, the constant performance, the forced dehumanization, and the inherent racism of the minstrel show weighed heavily on his spirit. One evening, while performing in a particularly rowdy town, a drunken patron, convinced that Jim was truly black, accused him of deception. The ensuing confrontation threatened to escalate into violence, forcing Emmett and the troupe to hastily pack up and flee the town. This incident served as a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Jim realized that his freedom, however limited, was constantly under threat. He began to contemplate escape once more, this time with a renewed sense of urgency. He found an unlikely ally in Norman, a fellow minstrel who had secretly confided in Jim about his own plight. Norman, a white man born into slavery, had escaped and was now living under an assumed identity. He had been saving his earnings, hoping to one day purchase his wife's freedom. Jim and Norman devised a plan. Norman, posing as a wealthy Southern gentleman, would purchase Jim from Emmett. This would provide Jim with a temporary freedom, allowing him to escape and reunite with his family. Their plan was executed with a degree of cunning. Norman, using his assumed identity, offered Emmett a substantial sum for Jim's services. Emmett, always eager for a quick profit, readily agreed to the sale. However, their freedom was short-lived. Henderson, the ruthless sawmill owner, learned of Jim's escape and pursued him relentlessly. A terrifying chase ensued, culminating in a violent confrontation that left Sammy, Henderson's female slave, brutally raped and murdered. Devastated and enraged, Jim and Norman fled the scene, narrowly escaping with their lives. They stole a skiff and embarked on a desperate journey down the river, hoping to evade their pursuers. Their escape was further complicated by the outbreak of the Civil War. The river, once a pathway to freedom, became a chaotic battlefield, teeming with refugees and military vessels. The tranquility of their journey was shattered by the constant threat of violence and the ever-present fear of recapture. One evening, while navigating the turbulent waters, they encountered a crowded steamboat, overflowing with desperate souls fleeing the south. The engine, overworked and straining under the immense pressure, overheated, causing a chaotic stampede as passengers scrambled to escape the sinking vessel. Jim, swept away by the surging crowd, found himself separated from Norman. He struggled to stay afloat in the chaotic waters, his life hanging in the balance. Miraculously, he managed to reach the shore, exhausted and disoriented. He searched frantically for Norman, but his friend had vanished into the swirling chaos. Grief and despair threatened to consume him. He had lost his friend, his freedom, and almost his own life. Yet, the memory of young George, the stolen pencil, and the fleeting moments of human kindness he had encountered along the way gave him a glimmer of hope. He knew he couldn't return to slavery. He had to find his family, to reunite with his wife and children, and to build a new life for themselves, a life free from the shackles of oppression.